Welcome, everybody. Um, Much appreciate you coming. We are the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy. We've been around for about 3.5 years now, and we are presently have members in 25 different countries. And we work on the human rights for people with disability on a global level. So much appreciate you all being here today. And since we are a Rotary Club, I find the four-way test is fascinating. Those of you who are familiar with the four-way test, and Jeremy will talk about it more in a minute, but it's fascinating because it's been around, Jeremy, for what, over 100 years at this point?
No, not quite. It was first started in 1932 and it was adopted by Rotary in 1943. But it's old
Ah,
enough. That's 80 years. That's plenty.
yeah. It's fascinating to me because it's so good. It's so good, but it's up to interpretation. People interpret it different ways, but always people quote the four-way test. I'm letting people in as I'm talking at the same time. From a standpoint of people with disabilities, it has a special meaning too. And about 3 years ago, Jeremy wrote an article about it, and it was a fascinating article. And that's why I've asked him to attend here today to talk about the four-way test and how it relates to people with disabilities. So, Jeremy, I'm going to turn this over to you and I'm going to pin you so everybody knows where you are. There you go. It's all yours, sir.
So let me introduce myself first and just explain who I am and what I do for a living and what I do in Rotary. So I'm a new Rotarian. I call myself a Rotary baby. Although it's not quite so baby now. I joined Rotary in October 2020 during COVID. So which means I joined as a Zoom member. So I literally hadn't met more than a handful of my club for a couple of months before I got to start meeting them. So my entire exposure to Rotary in the beginning was on Zoom. What was very quick to recognize was that I was the only blind member in my club, and very quickly I realized I was the only blind member in my district. So just a little bit backwards for me. I am a diversity practitioner, so I am proudly a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, and I have been since 1999. Even before that, in 95, I was selling DEI products in the form of a DEI program called A Matter of Respect, which was started by an African-American woman called Pat Carver. So I've had a 30-year relationship with DEI. What was and yes, so Rotary joined in 2020, and that's my background. I specialize in disability and DEI. One of the things we'll learn, and I'll talk about this a little more, is that DEI isn't necessarily inclusive of disability all the time, and very often is poorly dealt with. But I do a lot of work where I draw on the parallels of race and gender, as well as the issue of disability inclusion. And it's very important that we do that, and I'll explain a little bit more. So that's by way of background. Oh, one more thing is, in 2021, I participated in a webinar. Ken had something to do with it as well. And I was actually on the webinar with a man called Mark Wafer, and his wife Valerie was, and this was a Rotary webinar, was moderating. And Valerie had just started the Rotary International DEI Task Force. And as a result of my input in that webinar, I was asked to join the DEI Task Force. In 2023, that task force was asked, or rather was set up as a council. So we are an official Rotary International Council. This is in fact my last year, and I'll be stepping off that council in June. So that's by way of introduction. So let's talk a little bit about the four-way test and how it relates to DEI. How does DEI relate to disability. And therefore, this is a bit like an equation. How, therefore, does disability relate to the four-way test? Now, one of the first things we need to understand about the four-way test is that the four sentences, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? Those are great sentiments. They're wonderful. But we mustn't forget the introduction sentence. And that in many ways is more important than the other four, which is, of the things we think, say, and do. And I think we've overlooked that very often. You know, I've spoken to many clubs around the world, and I hear the four-way test being trotted out. In our club, we do it as well. And our club certainly mentions that first sentence. But, you know, when you are asked to repeat a sentiment, a statement like this over and over and over and over and over again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're growing the meaning. And that's part of the problem. So what I'm going to get across today is for us to take this sentence or this sentiment, this wonderful mantra that was developed in 1932 by a chap called Taylor, Herbert Taylor, who'd created it for his own business. And if you think of it from a business point of view, and I've heard many people saying, if only I'd heard this when I was young and in business, if only my business practiced this extraordinary affirmation. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Or will it be beneficial to all concerned? If we had applied that in our business, or if I had applied that in my business. And so it's clearly a very beautiful, very thoughtful, very powerful statement. And then it was clearly powerful enough to be adopted by Rotary in 1943. And Herbert Taylor later became president of Rotary International in 1954 and 1955. So he was obviously a very influential person in Rotary. So that's how Rotary adopted this wonderful statement. Now, I'm going to leave the statement for the moment, and don't forget that first part of the things we think, say, and do. That's the operative element to my mind, actually. Now let's talk a little bit about DEI. Now, anybody who isn't had his head under a rock will know that DEI is particularly in the news, particularly in the United States, and has something of a bad odor about it. Just saying the words enrage people. Staggering to see the level of enmity towards this term. And what I think is interesting is that very rarely do we break the words down enough. That acronym has become almost a swear word at the moment. And it's unleashing enormous destructive power in the attacks leveled against this harmless acronym. And what we need to do is we need to break it down and understand. So there is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or you can have DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Very good. And then my personal favorite is JEDI, JEDI, stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, if we say the words more than say the acronym, they lose their scariness, because you have to then interrogate each word a little more, which means you're applying your mind. But by simply trotting out that DEI does this and DEI does this, you're not applying your mind at all. So now let's unpack DEI a little bit more, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we need to look at ourselves from a disability point of view. We are I say we because I have the privilege of being an honorary member of this club. We are the World Disability Advocacy Group. And we need to see, how do we fit into the DEI narrative, the diversity, equity, and inclusion narrative. Now, from an academic point of view, there's absolutely no question that we belong. There's no question that disability firmly fits into the diversity, equity, and inclusion narrative. No question. Diversity, are people with disabilities included within a diversity context? Of course. Do many people with disabilities require equitable management or equity in some form to be able to belong easier? Of course. Do we wish to be more included? Of course. So it's academically, it's a no-brainer. But what's very interesting is those that peddle DEI, consultants, trainers like myself, sadly, the majority of them don't deal with DEI, with disability within the DEI context well at all. Because the majority of the energy, and this is not an accusation against those people or those elements, but the majority of the energy in DEI is in fact race and gender and LGBT, and disability is very, very, very often left off completely or badly dealt with. And you can spot it. If you were to if you ever were to
Yeah.
listen to a consultant who doesn't really know what he's talking about, you can see the language he's using is things like otherwise abled and differently challenged and nonsense like that. So two things. Academically, yes, of course it belongs. Practically, realistically, it's left off. And what does that mean ultimately? And here's the problem. What it means is that it very often isn't on the table. So let's leave the problems in the States with DEI and go to the rest of the world from a Rotary context. Now, Rotary, as Ken mentioned in the group a while ago, Rotary is probably the most diverse organization in the world. There's the lovely irony. 35,000 clubs, 500 districts, 24 zones. There's no question we are the most diverse organization in the world. That's the funny irony. But the trouble with diversity in a global context is that very often you'll get homogeny or homogeneity. So, for instance, let's take Japan. Now, 99.9% of Rotarians in Japan are Japanese. There's very little opportunity for diversity there. However, the majority, 85, even 90% of members in Japanese clubs are male, which means the opportunity for some form of diversity is there. In other words, more women, more women. And so one can have a lot of fun if you play with the diversity story. And that's what I ask people to do, is don't think in very narrow silo terms, disability alone. Always look at the parallels between race and gender, LGBT, and disability in the context of DEI. That issue of intersectionality. Intersectionality is an incredibly powerful word, often misunderstood, rarely spoken about by people who don't understand DEI. And intersectionality is where you need to apply things like, what is it like growing up in a very misogynistic society as a woman? And you're poor. That's intersectionality. So you've got poverty, you've possibly got race, you've got gender, and then on top of that, she has a disability. Those four things, that's intersectionality. So you've got to constantly apply. So the trick with DEI is to have fun with it. It's a little like Play-Doh or crazy putty. It's to play with it, manipulate it, turn it into things, you mold it, play with it, because the more you do that, the more fluent you'll be in the issue of DEI. And DEI is actually really exciting when you get into it because it's logical, categorically logical. So let's look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and within the disability context. And then we'll go back to the four-way test. So diversity, equity, inclusion. And then, by the way, think about accessibility as well while you're about it. Somebody wrote a very clever thing the other day I saw on LinkedIn is accessibility part of DEI? Once again, academically, absolutely. So let's prove it. Let's prove it. So diversity. So what would greater accessibility do? Well, it would allow for different people to be able to belong, to come in, to be part of. It would increase the diversity because instead of rejecting and pushing people away, it would encourage greater participation. That's diversity in an access context. Equity? Equity is not the same as equality. Equity is the things we do to be able to allow a person to participate equally. So inviting a person to just giving an invitation to a person in a wheelchair to a dance is one thing. That's equality. Encouraging them to get on the dance floor, that's equity. There's many ways, there's lots of quite amusing and interesting ways of unpacking the difference between equity and equality. But equity requires some work, and accessibility, definitely. That's the whole point of accessibility, is to apply equity so that the individuals, so that's almost the practical element. So the equity, the equitable application of accessibility allows people with physical disabilities particularly to enter. But access, of course, is way broader than just wheelchairs and ramps. So there's many, many things where we could apply greater equity in order for people with disabilities to be able to participate in society, not just in the workplace, but as consumers, as consumers, as business people, as scholars, students as well. And if you fail to apply that equity, then they will not be able to have the same chances. And then lastly, inclusion. Well, that's exactly what access does. Access ensures inclusion. Without access, you can't have inclusion. And so just they see how I've played here. I've just used one element of the disability narrative, which is accessibility, and I've demonstrated how important it is to insert into the DEI story. So disability, without a shadow of a doubt, falls squarely into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, if you throw that DEI out and you flush it down the toilet, then what you're losing is all the good work that's been done to encourage greater diversity, to, to apply equity, and to benefit from inclusion. So I'm very passionate about this, as you can probably tell. So now let's have a look and let's play a little. Now let's do a little matrix, and we'll look at the four-way test, and we'll look at diversity, equity, inclusion, or we can just look at the disability issue and see how it fits in. So here's the first one. Remember, the first sentence is every bit as important as the other four. Of the things we think, say, and do. Just the think. Just stop there. Think. Of the things we think about. Is it the truth? Now, how often does mainstream society think about disability, let alone disability inclusion, let alone disability in education, let alone disability in the workplace, let alone disability in retail and as consumers? And that is the crux, because it's exactly that which renders us invisible, because we don't, or they don't. There's not nearly enough thinking going on. So do you see how much texture I've put into just the first word of the four-way test? Think. Say. How often do we speak? One, truthfully. How often do we say the things which are fair to all concerned? How often do we say the things which will ensure goodwill and better friendships? How often do we say things which will be beneficial to all concerned? And lastly, do, of the things we say, think, say, and do. Practical, once again. And you can apply it. So you can see where I'm going with this. So I encourage you to play with the four-way test in your clubs, with your friends, and because the only way we're ever going to succeed in this game is if we increase the conversation about it. Here's an interesting thing. When I joined my club, I'm not sure if you can read the badge on my shirt here, that it's Newlands Rotary. Newlands is a suburb in Cape Town. Cape Town is a city in South Africa. And the district is 9350. And what I noticed was how many people were coming to me and saying, I've never spoken to a blind person about this or that. I've never had to guide a blind person. Will you show me how? I'm going to be giving a PowerPoint presentation. How are you going to manage? Those are wonderful questions. What it demonstrates is that they haven't had the opportunity before. Some of them have said to me, I've known several blind people, but I've never had a friend who is blind. That's how powerful this can be in Rotary. And that's why this club is so important, is we need to have this conversation so much to be able to ensure greater inclusion, greater diversity, and to be able to practice greater equity to include. So let's play a little bit more with our four-way test. So let's take disability in Rotary. Is it the truth? How many people with disabilities actually are there in Rotary? Is it true to say that they can't contribute? Yes or no? It's a true or false question. Is it true to say that they are incapable of leadership positions? Is it true that we don't have enough people with disabilities in our clubs? The operative question there would be, why? So is it the truth? Secondly, is it fair to all concerned? This is an interesting one. If you're going to exclude anybody, whether it's a beneficiary or whether it's an actual potential member or an existing member, if you're going to exclude them in any way, how could it be fair? How can it possibly be fair? Let me give you a little example of that. So my club funded a library, a school library in an area in Cape Town. And I believe very firmly that we need to apply greater diligence and rigorousness when it comes to looking at accessibility in our projects. And so the architects, unfortunately, I had nothing to do with the earlier negotiations. I didn't even know about it until they presented the almost final fait accompli of the project. And the architect spoke to us. And they were, how architects do, they present their gorgeous pictures about how beautiful their structure and their institution that they're creating is. And I put my hand up and I said, tell me, are you complying with our building regulations, where we have Section S of the building regulations, which is all about accessibility? And they sat there with a mouthful of teeth and they couldn't answer me, because the architectural community hasn't, in fact, spent nearly as much time understanding the issues of Section S of the building regulations. In other words, accessibility. And we're not the only country where that's a problem. Now, some of my club members were quite cross with me because they felt that I had embarrassed their speakers and they were the great architects who developed this library. And my point was, well, who isn't going to be able to use that library? How is that fair to all concerned? By the way, there's another interesting semantic game you can play here. What is the operative word in that sentence? Fair to all concerned. Is it fair or is it all concerned? Another way you can play with this. So let's go and get on now. Let's walk on to, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Once again, if anybody is being excluded, how can you? How sad that you'll never have better friendships than of the people who are excluded. And how can those people understand the goodwill? Most people with disabilities in my country have never heard of Rotary, have never had an experience of Rotary, either most of them from a beneficiary point of view, and certainly not from a membership point of view. And I doubt we're alone. So how, if we don't actually work at it, can we possibly have goodwill and better friendships being built? Then the next one is my last one, isn't it? It's also a great one. Will it be beneficial to all concerned? So back to my library, that project. How can it possibly be beneficial to all concerned if it's inaccessible? So I think the nutshell here is that don't treat this as a mantra. Don't treat this as a little slogan. Don't just trot it out without thinking about it. Play with it. It's a very, very beautiful, very clever, and very powerful mantra. And I think it could yield so much more if only we would unpack each one, including the first line, a lot more.
Yep. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Much appreciated. I knew it would be a fascinating conversation, and I love fascinating conversations. So it was much welcome. Hopefully, people got some time to think about some of the things you have to say either now or in the future. I'm happy to say that this club, the Rotary Club World Disability Advocacy, I think it's the most diverse club in history of Rotary. We're in 25 countries. We have a 50-50 men to women ratio. 80% of the people in the club have a disability. I don't think any other club can say that.
Not even
It,
close. Well done.
yeah, I think we're the most diverse club in the history of Rotary. I really do believe
How
that.
many members do we have?
If you count in the honorary members, we're up to about 50-55 members at this point.
And it's
So,
growing. It can't, it's not,
yeah.
it's
Oh,
going to grow.
I got a list of about 20 people want to join right now. So, much appreciated. And you were here right in the beginning, Jeremy. The story of you and I meeting is fascinating, but I'm not going to bore people with it. And much thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to Jeremy. And certainly, Jeremy, how do we get in touch with you if somebody wants to get in touch with you?
Well, my simplest email address is jeremy at disabilitydesk. That's disabilitydesk.co.za. So Jeremy at disabilitydesk.co.za. That's actually my website. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You're welcome to reach out. Um, and I want to thank you all. And you know what I really want to thank are the challenging questions. Um, so thank you for that. And so to close, all I want to say is don't stop asking. Always, always ask. Why is the most important question you can ask. So don't stop asking, and ask them aloud. Advocacy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Advocacy is not a silent exercise. This is not a retreat. Advocacy is a close cousin of activism. Nobody pays an activist, so that's why advocacy can often be a little more palatable. But we are the Rotary Club. We are the World Disability Advocacy Club. So go out there, be assertive, and ask. Thank you.